Defending the Earth, a dialogue between Murray Bookchin and Dave Foreman, published by South End Press, Boston, Massachusetts, 1991. Chapter 6. Where I Stand Now. Murray Bookchin. A year has passed since Dave Foreman and I discussed the problems and future of the ecology movement in a large New York auditorium along with Paul McIsaac, Linda Davidoff, and Jim Houghton. I have seen no reason over this year to alter any of the views I expressed back then. Dave is still under indictment for what I believe are charges trumped up by the FBI to harass the radical ecology movement. He has my strongest support in his efforts to defend his civil rights and to prevent the government and corporate interests from tarnishing the environmental movement as terrorist. Furthermore, over the course of this dialogue, I have come to respect Dave as a conservation activist and a human being. In the course of our dialogue, Dave and I have found some common ground. Important political differences still exist, however, as Dave himself readily admits. For example, in the past year, Earth First's Northern California groups, and possibly others as well, appear to have veered toward a degree of social activism and perspective that is far more consistent with social ecology than with a deep ecology perspective, even as amended recently by Dave. As Redwood Summer organizer Judy Berry points out, Earth First is no longer just a conservation movement, it is also a social change movement. Note. Judy Berry, Expand Earth First, 5. End note. I applaud the general direction of this ideological shift. Dave, however, has since left the Earth First movement to start a more narrowly focused wilderness conservation organization. There is a political difference here. My regret about the Earth First movement, which I have admired from its very inception, is that so many of its activists do not openly acknowledge that this de facto ideological shift has occurred. So much has the debate between deep and social ecologists biased many well-meaning people against social ecology that a certain moral pressure obliges them to call themselves deep ecologists and criticize leftism and social ecology even when they actually behave as social ecologists and even when some of them clearly have leftist backgrounds. Even Judy Berry, with her long-time background as an IWW labor organizer, has denied that she is a leftist and has argued that no leftist theory has ever spoken to the need for creating an ecological society. Note. Ibitum. End note. She also continues to misrepresent my views. I was shocked to read recently her unfounded assertion that I believe in anthropocentrism and that human beings are a higher form of life. Note. Judy Berry, Why I Am Not a Misanthrope, Earth First, February 2, 1991, 25. End note. This continuing hostility to social ecology raises the question, what lies at the core of the deep ecology versus social ecology dispute? Let me start by eliminating a formidable obstacle that stands in the way of clearly understanding this dispute. I've been told by a friend that many people regard the whole dispute as personal, in fact as a form of ego-tripping or ego-bashing on my part. This is simply not the case. I was on very good personal terms with Bill Duvall and a number of other prominent deep ecologists up to 1987, despite my concerns about the implications of their views. In 1986, I even received a warm season's greeting from Duvall with the remark, "Happy winter solstice. I hope we can continue our conversation and I feel I have much to learn from you." Duvall and Sessions's deep ecology had nothing but praise for my book, The Ecology of Freedom. Up until 1987, I simply had no reason for personal hostility towards any prominent deep ecology thinker or activist. It is also rather petty, I think, for deep ecologist Christopher Manes to suggest in his recent book Green Rage that the reason I criticized deep ecology was because I was in some sense personally envious of deep ecology's ability to touch people's lives while social ecology succeeded only in sweeping the halls of the Institute for Social Ecology. Note. Christopher Manes, 156. End note. At 70 years of age, I have neither the energy nor the time to envy anyone about anything, much less anyone's success in the ecology movement. My own life's work is basically finished, and I am reasonably content with it. My concern about the growing popularity of deep ecology is political, not personal. In contrast to Bill Duvall's contention that deep ecology is becoming a very embattled anti-establishmentarian body of ideas, I find that it has actually become very trendy and chic these days. It has not only swept into its fold a large number of well-situated academics but also a lot of journalists and even royalty, like Prince Philip of England, and other movers and shakers in the elite ecology establishment. My question is, have these recent converts to deep ecology become radical social critics, or is deep ecology congenial to their conventional, and sometimes even reactionary social views? Whatever its merits, the fact is that deep ecology, more than any other radical ecological perspective, blames humanity as such for the ecological crisis, especially ordinary consumers and breeders of children, while largely ignoring the corporate interests that are really plundering the planet. This socially neutral aspect of deep ecology appears to be very agreeable to the powers that be. I think this is the key reason that out of all the possible radical schools of ecological thought, deep ecology is being celebrated in popular magazines, in newspapers, on television, and in other media. When even so distinguished a writer and so socially committed a deep ecologist as Gary Snyder can write, "Mankind has become a locust-like blight on the planet," I am left to wonder what is so radical about deep ecology. Note. Quoted in Bill Duvall and George Sessions, Deep Ecology 171. End note. Can one join this crowd and still enjoy the luxury of calling oneself a radical ecologist? Please let us keep personalities and matters of ego out of the discussion, then, and let us stick to the politics that are really involved in the dispute. No one should forget that it is a strictly political fact that the late Ed Abbey, so revered by many self-professed deep ecologists, described the traditions and ideals of the United States as a product of Northern European civilization and warned us against allowing our country to be Latinized. Note. Edward Abbey, Letter to the Editor, Bloomsbury Review, April-May 1986. End note. It is a strictly political fact that he described Hispanic immigrants as hungry, ignorant, unskilled, and culturally, morally, genetically impoverished people. Note. Edward Abbey, One Life at a Time, Please 43. End note. It is a strictly political fact that misanthropy, who, I am advised by prominent Earth Firsters, is Christopher Maynes, welcomed the AIDS epidemic as a necessary solution to the population problem, generously including war, famine, humiliating poverty along with AIDS, and wrote, to paraphrase Voltaire, if the AIDS epidemic didn't exist, radical environmentalists would have to invent one. Note. Misanthropy, Sued, Population and AIDS, Earth First, May 1, 1987, 32. End note. It is also a strictly political fact that Dave himself declared, in his now regretted Simply Living interview with Bill Duvall, that the worst thing we could do in Ethiopia is to give aid, the best thing would be to just let nature seek its own balance, to let the people there just starve. Note. Dave Foreman interview by Bill Duvall in Simple Living. End note. I could go on almost indefinitely citing such remarks and the unhealthy moral climate they created. But I'm sure people are sick of it, certainly I am. I bring it up here again simply to remind people of the atmosphere that gave rise to my criticisms of deep ecology in 1987. This is all too often ignored. Even so respectable an academic deep ecologist as Warwick Fox persists in repeating my sharp attacks of 1987, pulling angry quotes out of my original Social Ecology versus Deep Ecology article without giving his readers the least hint as to the harshly misanthropic statements that inspired my anger in the first place. Note. For an example of Fox's treatment of Bookchin's criticisms of deep ecology, see Warwick Fox, Towards a Transpersonal Ecology 49. End note. I'm sorry to say that this approach leaves strong doubts in my mind about the moral integrity of many of my deep ecology critics. This concern is even further heightened by the fact that after I sharply attacked these chilling statements by self-professed deep ecologists, the greater part of a year passed before the more academic deep ecologists began, often very mildly, to voice any objections to the misanthropic remarks I challenged. Even then, these objections were couched in a rather backhanded way that frequently poured abuse on me while supposedly providing critical commentary on the statements by deep ecologists that had fired my anger. Indeed, many of my deep ecology critics have, over the last few years, systematically distorted my views as anthropocentric, painted me as an enemy of wilderness, and, as in Deval's case, even red-baited me as conspiring to lead anarchists, leftists, Marxists in a concerted attack on the radical ecology movement. Note: Bill Deval, Deep Ecology and Its Critics, Earth First, December 22, 1987, 18. End note. It probably should come as no surprise that such distortions have been widely peddled by an establishment media giant such as the New York Times, which has misquoted me as calling the Earth First movement fascist. I subsequently wrote the Times a curt letter flatly denying this allegation and voicing my support for Dave in his effort to secure his civil rights in the face of harassment by the FBI. What is more troubling to me, however, is how so many of my deep ecology critics have themselves pushed the absurd idea that I oppose the wilderness preservation goals of Earth First, or that I think Earth First activists are eco-fascists. Dave has been one of the few deep ecologists who has engaged me in a principled and respectful manner. I have appreciated his openness and integrity. However, the real questions that I think should concern us are these: are the misanthropic views expressed by the more blunt and presumably extreme deep ecologists mere accidents? Do they simply emerge from purely personal proclivities, or do they have roots in deep ecology's basic ideology? Leaving aside all the storm and fury of earlier debates, these questions should be of real concern to us. In the course of this dialogue, Dave Foreman has clearly pulled back from the precipice of the oppressive extremes that have been articulated from within the deep ecology movement. Yet if the deep ecology principle of biocentrism teaches that human beings are no different from lemmings in terms of their intrinsic worth and the moral consideration we owe them, and if human beings are viewed as being subject to natural laws, in just the same way as any other species, then these extreme statements are really the logical conclusion of deep ecology philosophy. Some deep ecologists such as Warwick Fox have used harsh words in condemning Dave's old views on famine in Ethiopia. Yet, if one is consistently biocentric, one can easily come to believe that Ethiopian children should be left to starve just as any animal species that uses up its food supply will starve. And one can also easily come to believe that AIDS is nature's revenge for excessive population growth, ecological damage, and the like. According to natural law, if lemmings' food supplies increase, their population will naturally increase to numbers that make them vulnerable to a die-off. Similarly, from a biocentric perspective, if there is a surplus of available food for people, human populations will automatically swell to numbers that eventually make them vulnerable to a die-off by making them so destructive of their environment until it can no longer support them. It was on the basis of this line of thinking that Dave originally spoke of letting nature seek its own balance, of letting the people in Ethiopia just starve. If one goes no further than biocentrism for one's primary guide to ecological wisdom, this is presumably a natural point of view. It should come as no surprise then that Bill Deval didn't find anything wrong with Dave's conclusions about Ethiopian children, either while he conducted the original interview in Simple Living or after I so inconveniently entered the fray, or that such statements were so lightly criticized, if at all, by Arne Ness, George Sessions, or other leading exponents of deep ecology. Such attitudes are simply a logical extension of biocentrism. But herein lies the rub: are people really only biological beings? Are they subject to exactly the same fluctuations in population that we find in the animal and plant world? I certainly do not wish to deny that, in fairly localized regional economies, bad weather, pest infestations, and unsound ecological practices can result in the deaths of innumerable people. But people, far more than any other animal species of which I am aware, are intensely cultural beings. Having emerged out of a long process of evolutionary development in which they were often subject to so-called natural laws in an evolutionary phase that we can call first nature, humans have created a cultural and social line of evolution of their own. This evolution is based on highly institutionalized societies that I have called second nature. Now, the existence of second nature doesn't mean that human beings are any less animal-like or natural than lemmings. But added to their primate bodies and possibly inborn communal tendencies is a highly complex cultural nexus of economic relations, symbolic forms of communication, hierarchies, classes, systems of domination and exploitation, political institutions, cities, technologies, and gender roles that greatly determine their population growth and overall environmental impact. Terrible as I believe a great deal of human history has been, we cannot ignore the overwhelming fact that the human species, itself a product of natural evolution, is no longer simply subject to natural laws. Human beings can play an appallingly destructive role for non-human life forms, or by the same token, they can play a profoundly constructive role. This is not preordained by natural law. Similarly, people can have an appallingly destructive or a profoundly constructive impact upon their own economic relations, forms of communication, political institutions, cities, and technologies. They can create an ecological society or they can easily destroy their own tenure on the planet. This super-added cultural ensemble markedly distinguishes human beings from all animals in terms of their life ways and their impact on the natural world. For example, unlike lemmings, human beings can redistribute their food supplies or they can accumulate their resources for a privileged few while denying them to the oppressed many. They can also establish codes of sexual behavior that determine population growth rates or change the social conditions that prompt people to have many children. Like it or not, this entirely new line of social evolution, second nature, has had a vast, all-encompassing effect upon all biological evolution, including first nature itself. Since this is true, we cannot simply wish away human social development as such by evoking images of a return to the wild Pleistocene or the benign Neolithic. Rather, we must honestly ask ourselves, how can human social development be brought into the ecology picture? Must we separate our ecological problems from our social problems? Must we regard human population fluctuations as merely matters of natural law? Must we ignore human suffering and thereby unconsciously blunt our sensitivity to suffering in the non-human world? I do not claim that all deep ecologists hold the views I have laid out here, of course. Dave has certainly modified some of his views in very significant ways. Indeed, a few deep ecologists even tell us that they are no less socially conscious than social ecologists. Yet this is rare, and when you ask them how their social consciousness relates to ecological issues, they usually become vague at best. It seems to be one of the most unfortunate features of deep ecology that its academic acolytes, knowing so very little about social theory, despite the fact that many of them are academic sociologists, have created a notion of biocentricity in which human social development plays a secondary role if any to natural development, in which population growth is treated exclusively as though it were a biological issue, and in which non-human suffering is placed on a par with human suffering. In almost purely zoological terms. Given that I believe that biocentrism is flawed at its conceptual roots, my deep ecology critics usually regard me as anthropocentric. But my point is not to denigrate the struggle to save and even increase wild areas, or the struggle to save forests from the lumber companies and developers, or the struggle to preserve and extend the range of wildlife and promote natural diversity. I have spoken up for such positions for years. Indeed, it is a shameful slander to even suggest that I do not support the struggles of Earth First and its militants. Thus, to those who dismiss me as anthropocentric, I must ask, why must I be forced to choose between biocentrism and anthropocentrism? I never believed that the Earth was made for human exploitation. In fact, as a dyed-in-the-wool secularist, I never believed it was made at all. I also don't believe that humans should dominate nature. The ultimate impossibility of this is a key idea in social ecology. Given my long-standing fascination with the wonders of natural evolution and, yes, wilderness, what need do I have for a biocentrism that deflects me from the social roots of the ecological crisis? I believe that non-human and human nature are as inextricably bound to each other as the ventricles of the heart are bound to the auricles, and that both human and non-human nature deserve moral consideration. An anthropocentrism that is based on the religious principle that the earth was made to be dominated by humanity is as remote from my thinking as a biocentrism that turns human society into just another community of animals. We need a much better perspective, I think. Whether there will be any wild areas or wildlife left in a century or so depends decisively upon the kind of society we will have, not on whether we lecture the human species over its failings, call it a cancer or worse on the planet, or extol the virtues of the Pleistocene or Neolithic. It will depend not only on our attitude toward non-human life but on the extent to which countless social oppressions are permitted to exist that compel peasants to cut down forests in order to survive, and that destroy their traditional life ways in the bargain. Even more fundamentally, and we had better get down to fundamentals if we wish to be radical in the real meaning of the word, whether there will be wild areas or wildlife left in a century or so depends upon whether we continue to preserve the grow or die economy, be it free market corporate capitalism or bureaucratic state capitalism, in which an enterprise or a country that doesn't grow economically is devoured by its rivals in the domestic market or in the international arena. Indeed, until humanity can actualize its evolutionary potentialities as highly creative and ecologically oriented beings, the antagonisms engendered by social oppression in all its forms will literally tear down the planet, both for human and for non-human life forms alike. To blame technology per se for this terrible distortion of second nature, to deal with human population growth as if it were not influenced profoundly by cultural factors, to reduce the basic social factors that have produced the present ecological crisis to largely, often purely biological ones, all this is to deflect attention away from the fact that our ecological dislocations have their primary source in social dislocations. The very notion of dominating nature has its roots in the domination of human by human, in hierarchies that brought the young into subjugation to gerontocracies, that brought women into subjugation to patriarchies, ordinary people into subjugation to military chiefdoms, working people into subjugation to capitalist or bureaucratic systems of exploitation, and so forth. Granted, we need profound cultural changes and a new sensibility that will teach us to respect non-human life forms, that will create new values in the production and consumption of goods, that will give rise to new fostering technologies rather than destructive ones, that will remove conflicts between human populations and the non-human world, and that will abet natural diversity and evolutionary development. I have written on these needs for scores of pages in books and articles. But does anyone seriously think these cultural changes can be achieved in a society that pits people against one another as buyers and sellers, as exploited and exploiters, as subjugated and subjugators at all levels of life? To deflect our attention from these crucial social questions with a biocentrism that basically ignores them at best or that blames a vague humanity for problems generated by a rotten social system at worst is to lead the ecology movement onto an ideological sidetrack. We have no need for biocentrism, anthropocentrism, or for that matter any centrism, nor for any ideology that diverts popular attention from the social sources of the ecological crisis. At the risk of being repetitive, let me stress that deep ecology's limited, and sometimes distorted, social understanding explains why no other radical ecology philosophy could be more congenial to the ruling elites of our time. Here is a perspective on the ecological crisis that blames our values without going to the social sources of these values. It denounces population growth without explaining why the poor and oppressed proliferate in such huge numbers or what social changes could humanely stabilize the human population. It blames technology without asking who develops it and for what purposes. It denounces consumers without dealing with the grow-or-die economy that uses its vast media apparatus to get them to consume as a monstrous substitute for a culturally and spiritually meaningful life. To fail to explore these issues, give coherent explanations of them, or provide a clear sense of direction in dealing with them, is to completely bypass the core problems that confront ecologically minded people today. It amounts to separating the ecology movement from the struggles of women for complete gender equality, people of color for racial equality, the poor for economic equality, subcultures like gays and lesbians for social equality, the oppressed of all kinds for human equality. Characteristically, the literature produced by most deep ecologists takes little, if any, note of lead poisoning in ghettos. It rarely, if ever, deals with workplace pollution, and the special environmental hazards that face women, ethnic minorities, and city dwellers. Laudable as Earth First's reverence for wild areas and wildlife may be, the failure of deep ecology to provide a radical social orientation to its admirers often leaves them as mere acolytes of a wilderness cult. Further, in its totally misplaced attack on humanity, deep ecology alienates many sympathetic activists who may respect wild areas and wildlife as much as deep ecologists do, but who are unwilling to flirt with misanthropy and self-hatred. Limits of space do not permit me to cite all my reasons for regarding deep ecology as far from deep. What I must stress is that social ecology is neither biocentric nor anthropocentric. Rather, it is naturalistic. Because of this naturalist orientation, social ecology is no less concerned with issues like the integrity of wild areas and wildlife than are biocentrists. As a hiker, an ecologist, and above all a naturalist who devoutly believes in freedom, I can talk as passionately as any deep ecologist about the trails I have followed, the vistas I have gazed at, or the soaring hawks I have watched for hours from cliffs and mountain peaks. Yet social ecology is also naturalistic in the very important sense that it stresses humanity's and society's profound roots in natural evolution. Hence my use of the term second nature to emphasize the development of human social life out of the natural world. This second aspect of social ecology's naturalistic perspective not only challenges misanthropy, it challenges conventional social theory as well. The philosophy of social ecology denies that there can be a complete separation, let alone a desirable opposition, between human and non-human evolution. As naturalists, we respect the fact that human beings have evolved out of first or non-human nature as mammals and primates to form a new domain composed of mutable institutions, technologies, values, forms of communication. Social ecology recognizes that we are both biological and social beings. Indeed, social ecologists go so far as to carefully analyze the important social history that has pitted humanity not only against itself but, very significantly, against non-human nature as well. Over the centuries, as I have said many times before, social conflicts have fostered the development of hierarchies and classes based on domination and exploitation, in which the great majority of human beings have been as ruthlessly exploited as the natural world itself. Social ecology carefully focuses on this social history and reveals that the very idea of dominating nature stems from the domination of human by human. This hierarchical mentality and system has been extended out from the social domination of people, particularly the young, women, people of color, and yes, males generally as workers and subjects, into the realm of non-human nature. Thus, unlike most deep ecologists, social ecologists understand that until we undertake the project of liberating human beings from domination and hierarchy, not only economic exploitation and class rule as orthodox socialists would have it, our chances of saving the wild areas of the planet and wildlife are remote at best. This means that the radical ecology movement must have programs for removing the oppressions that people suffer, even while some of us are primarily focused on the damage the society is inflicting on wild areas and wildlife. We should never lose sight of the fact that the project of human liberation has now become an ecological project, just as, conversely, the project of defending the earth has also become a social project. Social ecology as a form of eco-anarchism weaves these two projects together, first by means of an organic way of thinking that I call dialectical naturalism, second, by means of a mutualistic social and ecological ethics that I call the ethics of complementarity, third, by means of a new techniques that I call eco-technology, and last, by means of new forms of human association that I call eco-communities. It is not accidental that I have written works on cities as well as ecology, on utopias as well as pollution, on a new politics as well as new technologies, on a new ecological sensibility as well as a new economy. A coherent ecological philosophy must address all of these questions. Unfortunately, many grassroots ecology activists today cannot see any difference between eco-anarchism and the oppressive, industrial nightmares of Stalinism, or between naturalism and anthropocentrism. They are thus cut off from the vital and important insights that can be gleaned from the ecologically oriented, left libertarian tradition. Even Judy Berry, with her leftist background, seems to have trouble making such important distinctions. In an open letter to Dave after his resignation from Earth First, she argued that Earth First had no connection to the left, saying, "We are too irreverent and we have too much of a sense of humor to be considered leftists." Note: Judy Berry, Expand Earth First, 5. End note. I must remind Berry, however, of the simple fact that humor and playfulness have been integral parts of the libertarian left for generations. Not all leftists are poker-faced Stalinists, Maoists, or unimaginative liberal reformers. Wasn't it the industrial workers of the world, IWW, the largely anarcho-syndicalist Wobblies, who prepared one of the most hilarious songbooks in labor history, whose shenanigans drove the union busters mad with fury, and whose pranks form the haunting, if largely unconscious, inspiration of Earth First itself? Wasn't it the anarchic New Left of Paris in May-June 1968 that painted the city with such marvelous slogans as "Imagination to Power"? Be realistic. Demand the impossible, and I take my desires to be reality because I believe in the reality of my desires. Wasn't it the anarchist Emma Goldman, after all, who said that she didn't want to be in any revolution in which she couldn't dance? In closing, I just want to repeat that the ongoing debate and dialogue is not a matter of personalities, at least not so far as I'm concerned. It is a matter of very real political concerns about where the ecology movement is heading. Much as I love wild areas and wildlife, much as I recall the magnificent vistas and the quiet sense of freedom I've always felt in our forests, I will not ignore the social causes and the human suffering that lie at the roots of our ecological crisis and the absence of an ecological sensibility. I will not stand up as a judgmental pundit in an academic ivory tower or as a misanthropic wilderness activist and preach against a despicable humanity while lecturing to it about the glories of a vague abstraction called nature. Nature is very real and concrete to me, a living, ever-changing and wondrous development, as are its very real products called human beings. I refuse to mystify either nature or humanity at the expense of the other in the name of a simplistic, one-sided pair of ethical alternatives called biocentrism and anthropocentrism. I reject the need to make a choice between such abstractions with so little validity. I claim the right to be a naturalist and a leftist who rises above both vague simplifications and who relates the problems of ecological dislocations to those of social dislocations in the name of a social ecology. One of my major goals is to foster the development of a non-hierarchical ethics of complementarity among humans and between humanity and non-human life. This should be the fundamental starting point, the unshakable common ground, of the radical ecology movement. Perhaps the greatest contribution of this dialogue between Dave Foreman and myself is that it proves if radical ecologists can agree on this as their common ground, we can work together and, regardless of our other disagreements, productively learn from each other. In this, I believe, lies the hope of the ecology movement.